Welcome everyone. In this video I want to return to an already discussed topic, which is the cooling of the hot side of the Peltier cooler. And why I want to return is because I want to talk about some things in a bit more detail, so you can have a bit better knowledge and I can also explain things in a bit better way. So if you've been following my videos, you already know some stuff about Peltier coolers, how they work, and what do we want to do with them. But if you haven't seen any of my videos, I would like to just quickly explain a few things. So we have a Peltier cooler like this. This is a 15 ampere unit, and then obviously it has two sides. So one side is the cold side, and generally we use this to cool something down, and this is the hot side, and this is usually cooled down by something, which can be a water cooler or a CPU cooler or just a general heatsink. And how this works is that you should basically imagine this as a pump. So this device is particularly important when you want to cool down something below the ambient temperature. And how this works is that, as I said, it's sort of a pump. So the heat source is on the cold side, and that heat on the cold side is being transferred to the hot side by applying some current on this device. And if you just grab this device like this and apply some voltage and current on the wires, then you will notice that this side becomes cold and this side becomes warm. And that's why you want to cool something with this and want to cool this side so the device will not overheat. And here comes one of the misconceptions that some people have on the internet, that they usually make something like this. So they hook up the Peltier cooler with a heatsink, they use some thermal grease, and then they measure the temperature on the cold side. And they see that they can reach minus 20 degrees on the cold side, and they think, oh wow, this is a very good cooler. But this is a misconception, and because of these experiments, a lot of people think that, for example, they can build this into air conditioner or something like this because, wow, this is very cold. But they seem not to understand the basic concepts of the Peltier cooler. So let's just very quickly go through that, and then I will finally approach today's topic. So with a Peltier cooler, we usually have like two things that we want to see from the data sheet or from the performance chart. One is the DT, and that is the temperature difference between the cold side and the hot side. Generally, these devices can do something around 60, 70, 80 degrees Celsius. So for example, if your hot side is maintained at 50 degrees Celsius and the DT is 70, then the cold side will be minus 20 degrees. And this is so far very easy. But there is another important parameter, which is the cooling performance, that is usually noted with a QC. And what does that means? That is the amount of heat that can be transferred from the cold side to the hot side. And the DT and QC are closely related. If you have high QC, then the DT, the temperature difference between the two sides, is low. And if you have high DT, the QC, so the cooling performance, is low. So that means that if you are able to produce very low temperatures on this surface, that means that you are not able to transfer a lot of heat from the cold side to the hot side. And in the other way, if you are maintaining quite low temperature difference between the two sides, then you are running the device at a higher QC condition. So you are cooling properly, but you are not able to reach too large temperature differences. So you have to sacrifice one of these things. And this is where the misconception comes in. So when you see those demonstrations with some similar things, and you see that they produce -20 or sometimes even more temperature, or even lower temperature on the cold side. That is just simply that they just have this cold side exposed to the environment like this, or they cover it with something, and there is no heat transfer. So there is no heat to transfer from the cold side to the hot side, just this very small heat transfer with the environment. But that is not so efficient because the heat conduction of the air is very bad. So therefore the QC is very low, and you can achieve very high DT values. And that's what people don't see. So don't think that if you have a very cold surface here with the Peltier cooler that you can use it as an air conditioner. So then you can find the middle of these two things. So you can have quite good cooling performance, still not sufficient for air conditioning, but for some other purposes it's okay. So you can have quite good cooling performance while maintaining quite okay temperature difference. And how you do this is that you do not manipulate the DT value. So the DT should be quite low, let's say 20 degrees. So for example, if the heatsink is 30 degrees Celsius, then you are able to maintain 0 degrees Celsius on the cold side. But you can further improve this by keeping the system at the same QC and without manipulating the DT. Is you have to cool the hot side in a better way. So one thing is that you have to notice, and I already started to explain this, that if you have a heatsink or a CPU cooler, the lowest temperature that you can achieve, and let's say everything is now perfect and idealized, so the lowest temperature that you can achieve on the heatsink and therefore on the hot side of the Peltier cooler is the ambient temperature. So if your ambient temperature is 30 degrees Celsius, then your hot side by these kind of coolers cannot be brought under the ambient temperature. So therefore you are limited with the 30 degrees ambient temperature, and then you have to adjust your DT and QC to this ambient temperature. But what if you were able to do some tricks and decrease your hot side below ambient temperature? And one thing which is very expensive and not recommended is that you use the tap water, which is usually around 10, maybe 8 degrees Celsius, or even colder, it depends on where you live. And you maintain the temperature at the tap water's temperature on the hot side. But you have to waste a lot of water for that, so you don't want to do that. So for example, if your tap water is 10 degrees Celsius and you still keep your DT at 30, now you are able to reach -20 degrees on the cold side, and by also maintaining the same QC. So that's very good for us, but unfortunately that's a very expensive experiment. So what we want to do is we still use water, but in a bit different way. So the purpose of this video is to show you that you can actually have a better cooling with this thing by just using the physics and using some tricks. So what we want to do here is that we want to bring the temperature of this below ambient temperature and preferably keep it under ambient temperature. So I will show you an experiment for that. So what we do is the so-called evaporative cooling. So when the water evaporates, then it absorbs heat as it evaporizes, and this heat is called the enthalpy of vaporization. And this is a huge amount of heat, but it requires some conditions and it requires some tricks. So in order to maximize this thing, we have to optimize a few things. So in order to improve the evaporation, we can do several things. So one thing is that if we take some amount of water, let's say a cup of water, we can start our thought experiment on that. Then basically we can do like 4 different things which are like simple to achieve. we can increase the temperature of the water, and that will increase the average kinetic energy of the water, and then the molecules close to the surface will be flying off more easily. Therefore, they will evaporate more easily. But we cannot do that because we don't want to increase the temperature of the water, because if we increase it, that also means that we increase the temperature of the hot side. But our purpose is that we want to decrease the temperature of the hot side here. So we just skip that option. Another thing is we can increase the surface area, and we have this. You can see not too many fins and not too large fins as well. But if we go to this guy here, you can see that the number of fins are much more, and also the surface area of the fins is much larger. Actually, I measured this length and this height, let's call it height, and this is like 6 centimeters, and this is like 10.5 centimeters. But we have this corner here, so I said that let's just round this down to 10 centimeters while keeping this height as 6 centimeters. And then I counted the fins, and I also considered that each fin has 2 sides. So the total area of this heatsink is, I give you a few seconds to guess, but the total area of this thing is 0.54 square meter. So it's quite a huge area. I was surprised when I calculated this. But yeah, so if you increase the surface area, then you increase the chance of evaporation. But here, we are not talking about really the surface area of the heat sink. So now we are talking about the water. But why I mix this with this? Because then I can spread more water on the more surface, which I have here. And by that, indirectly, I can put more surface area of water on the more surface area of heatsink fins. But if you imagine a puddle on the ground, so if you have a small one and if you have a large one, and let's say they contain the same amount of water, so one is deeper than the other, for example, then the one with the larger surface area will evaporate quicker if every other conditions are the same, because there are more molecules on the surface are exposed. So this is one. And then we can play with the airflow. So one airflow is just, the fan is not running. So we have the convection in the room and stuff like that, and that's very inefficient, but that can work. And then we can turn on the fan, so we increase the airflow, or we can use a bigger fan, if you see, and more powerful fan, but there are some limitations. First of all, we have to ask how the airflow comes here. When we introduce airflow in an evaporating medium, what we do is that let's imagine that inside the fins there is water. I was sprinkling some water there or something like that. Then the water starts to evaporate, and there is a, let's say, bubble within this small area or small volume, which has a certain humidity. So let's say that due to the evaporation, the air inside this small bubble becomes saturated with water, so it cannot absorb more water, so the evaporation basically stops, and the cooling also degrades or actually stops, or that part of the cooling. And what we have to do here is we have to replace the air inside this volume. So that's why we need higher airflow, because then we can quickly replace the air, which basically absorbs the moisture from the surfaces, and then we can just repeat the evaporation quicker and quicker. Of course, this is a continuous process, but it's much more easier to imagine if you imagine it in steps. So you have the water droplets on the surface. The water droplets starts to evaporate. The vapor fills up this volume, and then this goes until the volume of air becomes saturated with the water, and then the evaporation on the surfaces will stop. So you have to replace that air. And of course, you will not wait until this saturation if you continuously run the fan, but if you just break down to smaller steps to be able to imagine what happens, then this is what happens roughly. So we can increase the airflow, but of course, you cannot increase the airflow infinitely, because of course the evaporation still needs time. And yeah, you cannot really force it if you don't have other circumstances in favor for the evaporation. And also, that is also related to the airflow in some extent, or more to the humidity, is that the intake air, so the air that you are pushing through the area which you try to use for evaporation, should be very dry. So you have to decrease the humidity. So if you put this in a room, then that room should be very dry. And yeah, so that's what we can do in order to increase the evaporation. So once again, increase the temperature, but in this case, we want to get rid of that. But what you do with the temperature increase is that you increase the kinetic energy of the molecules inside the water, inside the liquid water, and that will allow the surface molecules to leave the surface more easily. And then we increase the area. So that is not this area, but first of all, it's the area of the water. But we indirectly control that by the area that we allow for the water to occupy. And coming back to this area thing, is that you have to create very fine droplets to improve this area thing. So if you have this mist maker or something that can create almost a fog-like thing, or mist, then that's very good. So if you can use a humidifier or something and run that mist into the heatsink, then that would serve this purpose very well. And then the airflow, up to a certain value, we can use this fan or a larger fan, but after certain airflow, it will not really increase anything, and we can decrease the humidity of the air. So we have to use some dry air source. And coming back to the airflow, that is also important from another perspective. So if we change the airflow, we can change the vapor pressure of the droplets. And the vapor pressure is basically the tendency to evaporate from liquid to vapor. And this can be also demonstrated by differentiating between evaporation and boiling. So if your water evaporates, then the vapor pressure is lower than the atmospheric pressure. And when these things become equal or even larger, so the pressure of the vapor becomes larger or equal than the atmospheric pressure, then the boiling starts, and you actually start to form bubbles inside the water. So that's how you boil the water for your favorite tea or something like that. So that's also important. So we want the water to evaporate because evaporation absorbs energy, and energy absorption is basically sucking out the heat from the heat sinks. So with that, we can go below room temperature without any, let's say, active cooling. By active, I mean like a Peltier cooler, which needs electricity, or by a compressor-based refrigerator, because here we don't even need electricity to just have the evaporation, because that happens spontaneously. So I will show you 4 experiments. So I just attach a thermometer here by using this clip and this foam. So I made this grow to accommodate this thing, but the surface is a bit lower than the radius of this. So this will be used to clamp down the thermometer on the surface, so it will be a nice contact. But what I want to show you here is that I just run this and I measure the room temperature with other things here, and I measure the temperature of this copper plate. They should be same in the beginning. Then I turn on the fan and I show you that the fan is not a cooler. It's just, I don't know how to choose the words properly to make sense, but the fan will not cool the temperature of this system below ambient temperature. That's what I meant under saying that it's not a cooler. Of course, it cools the system if this thing is above room temperature, but now we are at room temperature, and I just want to show you that the fan's purpose is not to pump heat. So the only purpose of the fan is just to replace the air in between the fins of this heatsink. And if the cold side here is, let's say, cooling a CPU, which is, let's say, 60 degrees, then the air here is also being warmed up because of the hot heatsink. And then if you replace this air with constantly replacing this air with fresh air, then you allow the thing to cool. But it's not cooling. If I turn on the fan, there won't be any cold temperature appearing here. That's what I wanted to say. And then I turn off the fan, and then I spray some water in between the fins, and then I just keep measuring the temperature, and I will show you that the temperature will drop down. And then I will turn on the fan, and I will show you that the temperature will further drop down a little bit because I increase the airflow and I replace the humid air with fresh air. So there will be like 4 steps. But before that, let me talk about temperature measurement a little bit. So usually you can measure the temperatures in 2 different ways. And by that I mean that if you just expose your thermometer like this, then we are measuring the so-called dry bulb temperature, which means that we are measuring the air temperature, and we are not really accounting for the humidity. So we are just measuring the air. But you can make something like this. This will be called the wet bulb temperature, but this misses one thing, the moisture. So this is just a piece of cloth, and I will use this sprinkler just to make it wet, and we will measure the temperature of this. And what this does is that the evaporation of the water on this cloth is limited by the humidity of the air. And by measuring the temperature difference between the temperature produced on this thermometer and on this thermometer, or on the thermometer which measures the dry air temperature or the dry bulb temperature, then we can have some guess for the humidity. And as I mentioned, the humidity is very important when you try to apply evaporative cooling, because the humidity of the surrounding air will determine the efficiency of your evaporation. So if you have a completely dry air, the air can absorb the most amount of water. And also if you try to translate this to an everyday observation, then, so for example, if you start to sweat in a dry air area, then you will feel much colder as compared to the humid areas. So the problem with the humid tropical areas, for example, is that you are sweating, but the water sticks to your body and you cannot really evaporate your sweat. And by that, you cannot really cool down because you are just sweating, but the sweat is not evaporating from your skin. So the relative humidity is 100%. Then the air is not able to absorb any water, and then you cannot cool yourself down with sweat. That's very unfortunate. So now let's put together this thing, and I will show you what I mean. So first of all, I will spray some water on this. So this is wet, and I just keep it here. And then those will be our reference measurements. So let's give some power for the thermometer. This should come online soon. Yes. So this is the thermometer number 4. And you can see that the temperature, or I hope that you can see that the temperature is 24.5. And then these two guys are showing 25.7 and 25.7, or the green is occasionally jumping to 26. But they are just 0.3 degrees away. And this is showing 26.2. And the reason for that is because I was touching these things, so I increased the temperature by a little bit. But what we can see is already here, it's already interesting that, let's say the room temperature is roughly 26 degrees if I read the first 3 numbers, but the wet bulb temperature is 24 degrees. So this thing with water on it is already 2 degrees below the room temperature. So now this is dry and this is at 26.5 degrees. So I might expect just a little bit of decrease just because these other two things are measuring something lower. And that is because I touched this heatsink, so I increase the temperature. So what I do now here, I turn on the fan and let it run for a minute or something. And well, basically, if this would be at the room temperature, we should not be able to observe any kind of temperature change. But still, if I see everything is at the same temperature, so 26.5, 26, 25.7, and then this guy went down to 23.2. So we are 3 degrees, almost 3 degrees below the other temperatures. So that's yeah, quite interesting. So this thing, this guy here, went down to 26.2. That I was expecting that because I touched this, and the other temperatures are still unchanged. This is now at 23 degrees. So we see that the temperature difference is 3 degrees between this and this. And this is just because of the evaporation of the water. So let's say that we are at a good temperature, so I turn off the fan, because now we are reaching 26 degrees. So I equalize the temperature with the room temperature. So now I remove the fan. This is not running. Also, you might notice this from the lack of noise. So what I do now is I use the sprinkle, and I sprinkle some water. I try to distribute the water well in between the fans, in between the fins, and you should see some temperature drop here. And actually it should go down to similar values as this, so 22.5 here. So once again, I haven't done anything else. You can see that this is not plugged in, and I just sprinkled water on this. There is no airflow other than the airflow that I'm generating by talking and moving around and stuff like that, but there is no forced airflow here. So what we should observe now is that the temperature here, of course, we need some time to get the heat transferred, but the temperature measured by this thermometer, which is the first one here, should be dropping. And what I can see is that the temperature is already dropped down by 0.3 degrees, actually 0.5 now. So now we are jumping between 25.7 and 25.5, while these two guys here are still at 26 and 25.7. So they are representing the room temperature, and this started to go below room temperature. And actually this guy here is now at 22.5 degrees Celsius. So this is like 3.5 degrees below room temperature. And I would expect something similar from the evaporation thingy, but maybe not with this, because the problem here now is that the moisture is basically trapped inside this volume here. And since the airflow is very poor, then the temperature cannot really decrease here due to the poor airflow. So what we should do is that we might turn on the fan and see how the temperature changes. Because now we went down to 25.2 degrees, but that is still maybe too high because of the lack of airflow. So maybe we don't want to wait that much. So let's see what happens if I turn on the fan. So fan is on. I used some water inside, and now we are expecting some higher temperature, lower temperatures. So now the temperature is at 25 degrees Celsius, while the other two guys, these guys here on the top, they are at 26 degrees. And this is actually now 22 degrees. So that means that we are 4 degrees below the room temperature here. And now the temperature of the copper plate here reached 24 degrees, so 2 degrees below room temperature, 2.3 degrees below room temperature. While this is running, I can try to show you something, which is this guy here. So this is a mist maker. You have to immerse this in water, and then the mist will exit on this opening here. My problem with this is that it is spitting out water, so I cannot really put it here. I already tested this, but it's too messy, so it's covering everything with water when I'm running it. So what I will do, I will print some sort of pipe or an exhaust pipe for this that will allow me to spread the mist in a better way and hinder the water to get splattered everywhere. And I will just put it in front of the fan, or maybe I will make some tube, so I can insert this in between the fan and the fins of the heatsink. And by that I can cover the area of the heatsink with mist. And as I said, the mist has very large surface area. The water inside is made of very small droplets, so that's very good for us, and I can use that for cooling in a better way. So now the temperature started to go up on this side, and what that means is that the water is running out. And if I look into this thing, I see that the water is actually disappeared. I don't know how much you can see. It's not so visible through camera, but believe me, the water disappeared. So I will use my sprinkler and introduce more water. The problem with this thing is that it's just really difficult to introduce water in between the fins. And that's why the mist maker would be very nice, that I can make very fine droplets and they could just creep into the very fine crevices here. But what we can see here is that the temperature is 21.2 degrees Celsius. So almost 5 degrees drop. And that's very cool. I mean, it's very cold as compared to the room temperature. So we are very happy about that. But I'm not so happy that my cooler doesn't work as I want it to. So now I did something maybe stupid, but I inserted some or introduced some water here to some other areas of the heatsink. But what I wanted to show you is that these guys up here haven't changed their temperature, so still 26 degrees and 25.7 degrees. So this is pretty much the room temperature with some margin. And the temperature on the copper plate here is 23.7 right now, and the temperature here is 21.2 degrees. So that's very nice. And what I just wanted to show you is when you want to increase the cooling performance of your Peltier cooler, one trick can be to evaporate water with your cooler, and that would help the cooling process, because that will absorb an extra amount of heat from your heatsink, so it would help the cooling process. And that means that if you can keep this part, the hot side of the Peltier cooler, at the lower temperatures, you can stick to the same QC, but you can lower the temperature on the cold side, because you have to maintain the same QC, you have to maintain the same DT. If you change one of these, the other will also change. So the only thing that you can do in order to decrease the temperature on the cold side is that you have to decrease the temperature of the hot side. And if you bring that down, that will pull down the cold side as well, and that will improve your cooling. And now, as you can see, the temperature of this system went up to 24.5, so that suggests that the water is again running out from the fan. And I can see that there are barely just a few droplets inside the surface. So there is less evaporation, and therefore we cannot bring down the temperature that much. But this guy here became 21 degrees. But I believe that that also happened because we started to move air around, so we helped the evaporation a bit more. But still, it's a quite good set of numbers here, what we can see. So I hope that this explanation was not too confusing and you could learn something from this. Please don't forget to subscribe or leave some comments if you have some further questions in this topic. And you can also visit my new website, where I usually store some extra stuff, and I also have all the videos and everything. The website is curiousscientist.tech, so please don't forget to check that as well. And yeah, I hope you learned something, and I hope that this video was useful for you, and see you in the next video.